Games that don't push the limits of the NES, a topic suggested by a viewer. I can't find that comment now, so I don't know who you are, but well, thank you anyway. This idea has been germinating in my brain for a while now, and this isn't just going to be a load of bad games that don't work very well. I want to do something a bit different. This is going to be about NES games that don't use the system's full capabilities, that undervault it, figuratively speaking, for more interesting reasons, and yet still manage to be impressive in some way. To make it clearer, let's dive into the first example, Galaxian. Released in 1984, this Japanese exclusive is a straightforward port of Namco's very straightforward arcade game that was still big in its day and hugely era-definingly influential. Compared to what the NES became known for, Galaxian doesn't have much happening. Yes, this single field of aliens is the entire game. Xevious, another Namco arcade port released the same year, adds so much more. Yes, even in 1984, Galaxian must have already seemed pretty retro. So it might not be a surprise if I tell you that Galaxian is the smallest official NES game by a clear margin. Its entire ROM is just 16 kilobytes. The next smallest games, and there are a few, clocking at 24 kilobytes, like Galaxian sequel Galaga. And the NES's really big hits from later in its life are much, much larger. 10, 20 times the size or more. It's still, though, a great port of the arcade game, easily the best of the many that this saw at the time. It wouldn't be till the 90s that a more authentic home version would come out. Namco themselves handled this translation to the then new and very successful Family Computer, as the system was called in Japan, so it makes sense they'd want to get it right for their home market. Also, the Family Computer, or Famicom, was very well set up to handle a game like Galaxian for another reason. Its design was based on the original Galaxian arcade machine hardware. Galaxian in the arcade was a big success, and like all big successes, it inspired a lot of imitators, but not just of the game itself, but its underlying technology. Other arcade developers quickly began to make their own new original games based on the Galaxian machine. Sega, Konami, Nintendo, everyone in the Japanese games industry got in on the act, and it quickly became a de facto standard. Nintendo's Donkey Kong being one of the many, its own mainboard, a modified and slightly improved Galaxian machine at heart. When Nintendo came to make their own console, what became the Famicom and the NES in the West, they did the obvious thing and made a home version of what had brought so much success in the arcade. Some things didn't survive the jump to consumer-level home electronics, but the tile-based graphics did. That was what made Namco's Galaxian technology so popular. Its innovative new way of displaying graphics was massively versatile and allowed for lots of fast, colourful graphics without having to use lots of expensive RAM. So Galaxian doesn't push the limits of the NES. Its tiny ROM size, much smaller than any other game, but more than that, this is what the NES was made to do. This is what sparked its creation and began the video gaming paradigm it was born in. It's far from being the worst NES game, anything but. If you still love the old school arcade blasters, this is a winner, but it's not a limit pusher. But let's leave this behind now and look at another bona fide arcade classic with Mario Brothers. Yes, that's Mario Brothers without the Super, a port of the original arcade game from 1983, but it might not look quite the same as any version you remember playing. There's something a bit different about this, and again, size plays a role. You see, the first NES game cartridges maxed out at just 40 kilobytes, a weird number actually that's related to the system's arcade origins. 32 kilobytes of program data, game code essentially, and 8 kilobytes of graphics data. Arcade motherboards split up data in the same way, but most other consoles never did. 40 kilobytes though soon wasn't enough, and Nintendo and other companies soon began to expand the size of their ROM cartridges. And that wasn't just a case of adding bigger ROM chips, they needed to make that extra storage accessible too, organised in banks that could be swapped in and out of the NES's memory layout, and they also often added extra features too, upgrading the NES with the cartridge. This became absolutely the norm in the later half of the NES's life. Virtually every game used what was called mappers to expand cartridge capabilities, which leads to the question, what was the last game to use the original cartridge system? Mapper Zero, as it's called. Well, I'm pretty sure it's this, Mario Bros. Mario Classics Edition from 1993. This isn't just another reissue of the 1983 version of the game, a launch title for the Famicom, but a new sort of remastered edition, which includes improved jump physics and graphics from the Japanese Famicom disc version, and also adds in the cutscenes from the original arcade game. Released for some reason only in Germany, this is probably the best version of Mario Brothers. The new jump physics are particularly welcome. You can now change direction in the air, making this feel much more natural to modern Mario gamers. It doesn't though go past the 40 kilobyte barrier, the last game made with the completely unexpanded NES, with a ROM 20 times smaller than Kirby's Adventure, which came out the same year and also had 8 kilobytes of work RAM, a save battery and other stuff in there too. So this edition of Mario Brothers is another game that was already pretty old school when it came out, but is still far from bad. Going further down this path, we've seen the smallest official game for the NES, but are there any unofficial games that are smaller? Unlicensed games, Homebrew, anything like that? Well, the awful Action 52 does come to mind. Oh dear, how big are these terrible games? An attempt at a legal version of pirate multicarts, but barely more than an outright scam, and of course fuel for many YouTubers. I thought perhaps these games would be very small to save space and increase profits, but actually the cartridge is a huge 2 megabytes, the largest non-pirate NES ROM for a long time. The huge size, the reason this was sold or was attempted to be sold for a ridiculous $200. They couldn't make it any cheaper. Dividing that 2 megabytes by 52 gives about 40 kilobytes each, but of course it's not so simple. There's the intro and the menu to account for, plus games reuse code, and well, it's not easy to work out what's going on, but these games, it seems like, aren't less than the 16 kilobytes of Galaxian. That means we can ignore this rubbish and move on to the actual smallest games, which are all entries in the minigames competitions from the 2000s. This is NES Snake from the 2004 competition, making this old enough to be retro, but it's still a very fine version of Snake that fits into a tiny 4 kilobytes. It does all it needs to with a very limited ROM size. Nicely efficient coding here from creator Matrix Z, and yes, that 4K is the whole thing, graphics and all. But we can go even smaller than that with Pong 1K from the same year, I think, which is, yes, 1 kilobyte Pong. And there's also this, Target Blitz from 2003, another game crammed into 1 kilobyte. The minigame competition doesn't seem to be a thing anymore, sadly, and even though there's plenty of NES homebrew games out there, of course, no one seems to be working with such tiny size constraints at the moment, so I think this is as small as we're going to get. But I can show you something with another unique constraint that's smaller in a different way. This is Magic Floor, a puzzle game I can't quite get the hang of, and yes, once again, impressive in an unimpressive way, because this is a very unusual, vanishingly rare, one-chip NES game. As I said before, NES cartridges store program data and graphics data separately. Really what's going on in most carts is that there is a program ROM connected to the main CPU and then another chip connected to the graphics chip, the PPU. This second chip is really essential. The PPU needs to have graphics data to be able to draw stuff on the screen with. Most games have a fixed ROM chip here, but instead some substitute this for RAM, which is then filled by the CPU, making the NES operate much more like any other console, which nearly all have RAM connected to their graphics chips. The mini-games we saw use RAM here, as do some commercial games like Ghosts and Goblins and Contra. There were a few games released on special single-chip cartridges from Bandai and Codemasters, but they both required the use of adapters which had RAM chips built in, so really there's still two chips actually connected to the system with these games. But Magic Floor does what seems to be impossible. It's a working game with literally only one chip, as is I think the only other game of this type, Starfight, from the same creator. A bit more accessible this one, an arcade style shooter, perhaps even more impressive than Magic Floor. But how is this done? How is one chip ditched? Well, it uses the NES's own RAM. You see, on top of the memory chip that must be connected to the PPU in most games, the NES also has 2 kilobytes of special graphics RAM too, usually used to store the layout of graphics. That is the position on the screen of all the graphical elements, 2 screens worth usually, but these games sacrifice half of that using one single screen's worth of graphics layout. The other half is used to store the actual graphics tiles, replacing the second chip. This only allows for 64 unique graphics tiles to be stored at once, but that is enough for games like this. To actually make this work on a real NES, there's just literally a wire in the cartridge that reroutes the PPU memory address to the internal RAM, but that is all it needs, cutting back the NES hardware to the bare minimum. Not pushing the limits, but actively reducing them. A strange but impressive achievement. And that's something you could say for this next game too, Zacna, which also operates on a reduced capability machine via Family Basic. An expansion for the Japanese Famicom that's let you program games for the Famicom on the Famicom itself in the basic programming language. Yes, this is a Japanese exclusive, but both Family Basic and this game will work fine on the Western NES with some adapters. They are the same thing underneath. The actual basic cartridge doesn't add any extra processing power or anything like that either. In fact, it reduces what the Famicom can do. You're limited to just 2 kilobytes of storage space to run your basic code from, and you're also limited to using the graphics that come built into the cartridge. There's 8 kilobytes of various text characters and some very old school Nintendo sprites and background elements to choose from, but that is all you've got. You can't define your own graphics. Most Family Basic games were pretty simple, whether the sample programs that came with it or the type-it-yourself listings that were created by fans and published in magazines like Famicom Basic. They tend to look and play much like the basic games you'd find on the home computers of the era, and that's no surprise really, because both the capabilities of the underlying machine and this version of BASIC are pretty similar to many home computers. Zacna is a bit of a cut above though, with its smooth graphics and boss fights, and its sequel Zacna 2 goes even further. Both games were published as a printed magazine listing, but Zacna 2 does make use of the slightly upgraded Family Basic 3.0, which gave you 4 whole kilobytes of memory to fit your game into. With that extra space we get huge bosses and some very nice software sprite rendering that allows for the huge lasers on screen without hitting the NES sprite limit. Both these games were created by Koichi Yoshida, who later went on to create the now legendary shoot-'em-up Cho Ren Sha on the Sharp 68000. Released a couple of years earlier though by the same guy is the insane Metal Itu. It looks like an early bullet hell game, and well, it is, inspired by arcade shooters from Toaplan. It's got bullets absolutely everywhere, leagues of enemies, flashy power-ups and some more huge bosses who know how to make a very big entrance. This looks far too good to be programmed in pure BASIC, and well, it's not. Like all three of these games, in fact, the creator hacking the Family BASIC cartridge to allow for routines programmed in assembly language. Yes, compared to commercial games, this maybe doesn't look that good, but it's amazing for a game that came from a printed listing. I did make a whole video a while back about Family BASIC where I talked about this and other games. If you want a bit more detail, I will link below. But now let's shift gears again and take a look at Astro Smash, and yeah, this doesn't look quite like the top of the line state-of-the-art NES gaming from any period in its life. This looks, well, oddly primitive and perhaps oddly familiar for serious retro gamers. In fact, this isn't an NES game at all. It's a classic Intellivision game, somehow running on the NES. This is Intellivision for NES, unsurprisingly, an Intellivision emulator for the NES. That's what it is, by Carl Muller Jr. So yes, Astro Smash, Shark, Bowling, Adventure and the others that are included in this package really aren't games that push the NES at all by themselves, but the emulator that runs them certainly does. Quite how this works, I'm not sure. It seems so strange to have any kind of emulator running on the NES. I wouldn't have thought it was possible on such a simple machine. Especially considering that the Intellivision has a 16-bit processor and the NES has one that is very much 8-bit. Computer science tells us that all Turing-complete processors are fundamentally the same. When you get down to it, anything one CPU can do can be done by another in theory. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily practical to do it, so it's still a surprise to see it actually working. Usually you need your emulator to be running on a system much more powerful for it to be usable. The Intellivision was one of the very first game systems, if not the first, to use tile-based graphics like the NES uses, so it's a bit less surprising to see that the NES graphics capabilities are able to recreate what the Intellivision does. But that said, the Intellivision had a wider aspect ratio, so these games have to scroll horizontally to fit everything in. There's not much information about this online, even the creator's website is sparse on details, but he does mention that this emulation uses some sort of pre-processing. You can't load just any Intellivision game on this emulator, you have to use the ones that come as part of the package. Looking at this with a hex comparison tool seems to tell me that the original ROM files aren't just included as is. There's nothing that quite matches up, which suggests that these games have been processed in some way to make them easier to run. One thing I am pretty sure of is that these aren't just recreations of Intellivision games ported directly to the NES. That would look a bit different. Probably something like this. Yes, this is Astro Smash again, originally for the Intellivision, not running on an emulator but ported directly to the NES. Why? Well, this was done by Chinese company Nice Code Software for the Intellivision Flashback plug-and-play console. Instead of recreating the original hardware somehow or using modern hardware running an emulator, the Intellivision Flashback was really just an NES on a chip clone running ported versions of the classic games, probably because that was the absolute cheapest way of doing it. Yes, we also have Shark as well, running on the NES, a weird situation. Games that definitely don't push the limits of the NES because they were specifically coded to look like games from a less powerful system. Quite a few of these plug-and-play systems were secretly just NES clones running recreated versions of games, including one of the original Atari 2600 flashback systems. That seems particularly egregious as the NES can output far fewer colours than the Atari 2600, meaning games like Yar's Revenge here look a lot different than the original. There was also some sort of Konami-themed plug-and-play which did feature some genuine Konami NES games, but also new ports of some of their arcade games which never saw an official NES release, including Scramble here. This actually could easily have been a legit NES or Famicom release. If Namco ported Galaxian, Konami might have done this. There's also Frogger, another classic that didn't quite make the NES, but could have done, and yes, guess what? These games were also based on Galaxian hardware too, so doubly appropriate that they're eventually ported to the NES. These games are all legit in the sense that they seem to have been officially licensed from the original developers, but they are running on bootleg NES clones that are certainly not licensed by Nintendo. But that got me thinking, one thing that the NES became known for was endless bootleg games from all over the world, so what was the first? Well, it looks like it might be this, Super Maruo. Released in 1986 in Japan, this ludicrously simple game has you attempt to catch the girl whilst avoiding the dog. Your reward, if you do, being a very crudely drawn striptease, which I won't show for obvious reasons, but it's hardly explicit really. This game was apparently sold in very small numbers, possibly because of action from Nintendo, but also possibly because it's a bit crap, and it was quite expensive at the time. Kudos though to whoever developed this. It can't have been easy to be a pioneer in this field back then, when I'm sure info about the inner workings of the Famicom and how to develop games for it were hard to come by. There are some mysteries around this game. Apparently the original cartridge had some sort of switch on the front, not the usual arrangement for Famicom carts, and no one knows quite why it's there. Also, this game somehow ended up being bootlegged heavily in Argentina in the early 90s. How something so very obscure ended up there is not known, but that's probably the reason why it's been preserved, the proliferation of copies of it over there. There's also a third mystery that I would like to add, why this game uses up so much ROM space. Yes, this is a 40 kilobyte cartridge, the same as Mario Brothers that we've seen, Super Mario Brothers, Xevious, and many others that were a lot more complex than this. The 8 kilobyte graphics ROM is filled with the crudely drawn erotica as mentioned, but there's 32 kilobytes of program data, which seems an awful lot for what is happening here. I do wonder if something more is hidden, maybe something to do with that switch, but let's leave that for now. We've seen the first bootleg. What was the first homebrew NES game? Well, I think Mouser might be it. Created by Tony Young, 1997 is the date on the title screen, but a lot of sources list it as coming out later than that, and this is, well, theoretically an NES game. And I say theoretically because this won't work on real hardware or even a modern accurate emulator. This only works on very old school and not totally accurate emulators like Nesticle. Not that this game does anything the NES can't do, it just doesn't do it quite right. Unimpressive in a very impressive way though, again just for being a pioneer. Toby Young did come back and finish this game years later, making a version that actually does work on real hardware. Moving on again though, Solar Wars from 2001 might be the first real complete homebrew game, one that absolutely works on real hardware and does so very nicely. Created by none other than Chris Cavell, whose name seems to end up in every video I make, but he's done a lot of great stuff over the years on the NES and other platforms too. Inspired by the shareware games from the 90s like Tanks on the Amiga, which also inspired Team 17's Worms, this is a game that might look familiar, but I think it might be the only game of this type on the NES. Again, this isn't the most limit-pushing game there ever was, but it's impressive just for being made so early in the homebrew scene. It even uses the MMC3 enhancement chip, I think the first homebrew to do that. And yeah, quite a nice soundtrack too, but we do seem to be drifting into some very deep cuts from the NES library, so let's go back a bit more to slightly more commercial games, starting with Metal Slader Glory. And yes, commercial is a relative term here because this Japanese exclusive wasn't the biggest game ever, even in Japan. But it was a proper cartridge release, and it's that cartridge that puts it on this list. This game and its unofficial translation patch is something that I have spoken about before and not all that long ago, but I couldn't resist putting it in here, especially as last time it was in the context of it being a game that pushed the limits. How can it both push the limits and not push the limits? Well, it's in a quantum superposition thanks to some classic Nintendo trickery. the magnum opus of artist Yoshimitsu Hoshi, who designed this visual novel for the very close associate of Nintendo, HAL Laboratory. This was developed over 4 years, an unusually long development cycle for a game back then, and much of that time was spent creating the game's massive amount of luscious pixel art. Of course, the NES has a lot of graphical limitations, and fitting the creator's vision into them was a challenge. The NES has a palette of 56 colours, and you can have 25 of them on screen at once, but you can't just put any colour anywhere, there are rules. In each 16 by 16 pixel block, you can have just one colour palette of 3 colours plus a background colour, and you only get 4 colour palettes in total for the whole screen. On top of that, you can also use the sprite layer to add extra detail and colour, but you still only have a limited number of unique 8x8 tiles you can use, and well, it's not simple coming up with graphics that both look good and fit with the technological boundaries. Wouldn't it be ironic then if Nintendo developed a fancy new enhancement chip that removed many of the NES's restrictions just as this game was being completed? Even more ironic if they got HAL Laboratory to use this chip despite the game not being fully programmed to take advantage of it. And even more ironic, sorry I'm running out of superlatives here, even more doubly ironic if this was the reason the game didn't sell that well. Yes, Nintendo's MMC5 chip removed a significant restriction, allowing each tile to have its own colour palette and enabling more unique tiles on the screen. This could have led to more detailed graphics and potentially made them easier to create. Sadly, it seems like this breakthrough came too late for them to take advantage of it, and the game was already the largest official Famicom cartridge at 1 megabyte. Adding more features would only have increased this size. Nintendo allocated HAL Laboratory 20,000 MMC5 cartridges at a reduced cost, but no more. Once the first batch sold out, the game effectively went out of print. There's no clear explanation why exactly, but presumably making more must have been too expensive to be worthwhile. Whilst they did use some MMC5 features for sound effects and some technical enhancements for displaying text and graphics at the same time, these weren't enough to really utilise the chip's full capabilities. Few games in the end used the MMC5 mapper, and none came close to its full potential. Metal Slader Glory could have really benefited from this chip's full features if time and economics had allowed it, probably more than any other game released at that time. The MMC5 allows for ROMs up to 2 megabytes, but to try and keep costs down, they squeezed the game into 1 megabyte and had to cut lots of content. What might have been, eh? So yes, this game does go further than any other Famicom or NES game of this type, but it doesn't go quite as far as it could have done and lost out because of it. This game helped to lead to financial troubles for HAL Laboratory, which led to Nintendo bailing them out and Satoru Iwata taking over before ultimately becoming president of Nintendo, and well, a lot of stuff resulted indirectly from this game, let's just put it that way. No one else would do anything like this though, would they? Not develop a whole new fancy enhancement chip and barely use it? Yes, repeatedly, especially on the Super NES, but for the purposes of this video, it was Konami who said, "Hold my Nihonshu," and put out Tiny Toon Adventures 2. Not quite a storming hit or even a cult classic, this licensed platformer may at first look like it might be more of the quick cash-in shovelware that filled the library of every console, and honestly it sort of is. A bit of a disappointing sequel to a great original, not Konami's best work, but it's still not a terrible game, and technically it's fine. The graphics look good, the controls are responsive, the multi-directional scrolling does what it's supposed to, but once again this underutilises the high-tech gubbins underneath in a fairly big way. You see, the Japanese version of this game, and just the Japanese version, uses Konami's very advanced VRC7 enhancement chip. Not quite as sophisticated as the MMC5 in some respects, but it does outclass it in others, especially sound. You see, the VRC7 chip has an advanced FM sound synthesis module built into it that Tiny Toon Adventures makes no use of at all. Now, if you want to know what this synthesizer sounds like when it's actually being used, well, here is Lagrange Point, the only other game that uses this chip and the only one that actually bothers with the sound. Yes, the audio in this is absolutely superb, unlike any other Famicom game. I've covered this before, it really is a fantastic game and does have an unofficial English translation patch despite being a Japan-only release. The music and the atmosphere is incredible, and the sound circuitry that this uses is of the same family and similar in a lot of ways to what was used in 16-bit systems like the Mega Drive. But in Tiny Toon Adventures 2, the chip stays completely silent and the game just uses the built-in NES sound capabilities like virtually every other game. It seems weird that it would make financial sense to include a whole new synthesizer chip in a game, but it's frankly bizarre that Konami thought it made sense to put one in and not use it. It doesn't even bother with the other advanced features that the VRC7 offers either. This could have been done with something much less sophisticated, and we know that for certain because that's what the near-identical Western releases use. Nintendo wouldn't let developers use their own mapper chips outside of Japan. They had to have their cartridges made by Nintendo themselves using Nintendo's chips, and Tiny Toon Adventures 2 uses the much less complicated MMC3. Konami must have known this as well as anyone, and they must have designed the game to work on the MMC3 from the start, so why the Japanese version of the game has high-tech features hidden away is a puzzle. They could have gone with one of their own simpler mappers in Japan too, it surely would have cost less. I can only guess that they had a load of these VRC7s left over that they needed to use up. The 8-bit market was dying out by this point and they must have thought they'd just get rid of them whilst they could. They did save a bit of money, and the cartridge does lack the audio mixing circuitry required to actually output the sound to the console, but that relatively complex synthesizer is still in there, unused and mute. So I think I can call that the end now. If you haven't played either Metal Slader Glory or Lagrange Point, they're both great games. Give them a go if you can. If you want to try out those Famicom Basic Games as well, a Google search will bring up some resources. The website Gaming Alexandria has a load of that stuff, and most of the games do have ready-made ROM files that will run no problem in most emulators. So time once more to say thank you so much to my ever wonderful Patreons. Thank you so much. If you would like to join them, there is a link below, and I will say goodbye and thanks for watching.